Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our third session of Creating and Sustaining Inclusive Community Series. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I'm one of the Housing Center of West Michigan's Education and Outreach Coordinators. We have some special guests joining us for this session, and I'll dive into who they are in just a moment. First, I wanted to go over some housekeeping things. Uh, all attendees are muted and your cameras are off, so we cannot hear or see you. Please put any questions into the Q&A. We will address any clarifying questions during the presentation, but we'll dive into more of attendee questions at the end. If you have questions for a specific person, please use their name in the Q&A to allow us to direct the question to the intended panelist. Evaluations will come up automatically in your browser, and we'll provide a link to it in the chat at the end as well. Please let us know your thoughts on the presentation. As a note, especially for those who may be familiar with our trainings, we will not be providing certificates for this session. And lastly, this session is being recorded, and we will let you know by email when the recording comes available. Okay, now that the boring stuff is out of the way, thanks again for joining us. We are really excited for today's session and to hear from our panelists. This series was created to empower community members with practical information to work towards more inclusive and fair communities. After introducing our panelists, I will provide a brief overview of fair housing and the prior sessions to provide context for those of you who may have not had a chance to join us. Then I will turn it over to our moderator, Yarrow Brown, to dive into questions we have prepared for our panelists today. And again, if you have questions for our guests, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Today, we have lined up 4 wonderful speakers who have been working in the housing development arena with various experiences and insights. First, we have our moderator, Yarrow Brown, Executive Director of Housing North. Yarrow brings a diverse background in real estate transactions, project management, strategic planning, and other technical skills. Her background includes working with diverse groups of people from landowners to government employees, lake associations, township officials, and many more. She sits on the FHCWM board and served on the Cleveland Township Planning Commission in Leelanau County for 2.5 years. Next, we have Ryan Kilpatrick, founder and CEO of Flywheel Community Development Services. Ryan has a background in economic development, affordable housing, neighborhood design, and public finance. As a former executive director of Housing Next, he helped to define access to housing as a core economic development issue for West Michigan through data-oriented dialogue and partnership with employers, local municipalities, chambers of commerce, and developers. Ryan has 15 plus years of experience supporting local units of government, community foundations, and developers with technical assistance and best practice implementation through planning, zoning, process improvement, and the use of financial tools to create economically vibrant communities. Our next panelist is Eric Hanna, President and CEO of Michigan Community Capital. His role as president and CEO, he leads fundraising, public policy, and advocacy, as well as cultivating a culture of professionalism and collaboration among MCC's team. Before joining MCC, Eric worked in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, including roles in consumer and commercial banking and with the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. He has been instrumental in drafting both state and federal legislation focused on community economic development and small business capital support. In addition to his role at MCC, Eric volunteers as the treasurer for the Old Town Commercial Association, a national and Michigan Main Street organization leading community organizing and redevelopment efforts in Old Town Lansing. And last but not least, we have Sarah Ford, Director of Community Philanthropy at the Petoskey Harbor Springs Area Community Foundation. Sarah is an experienced nonprofit professional who worked with statewide nonprofit membership organizations prior to joining the philanthropic sector. She's a graduate of Leadership Little Traverse and serves on the board of the Zonta Club of Petoskey. In addition to her role at the Community Foundation, Sarah is on the leadership team for the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, a community group who is building housing solutions through awareness, advocacy, and action in Emmett County, Michigan. Thank you all for being here, and we are really excited to hear from you all. As mentioned, I will now provide a brief brief overview of fair housing and housing development to help frame the conversation we will be having today. So, if this is your first time hearing about our organization, the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan is a private nonprofit fair housing organization that was founded in 1980. Our mission is to prevent and eliminate illegal housing discrimination, to ensure equal housing opportunity, and to promote inclusive communities. We do this through various ways, such as providing education to housing providers in the community, like today, as well as this, we have an enforcement and advocacy, which accepts allegations of housing discrimination and works with clients to advocate for their fair housing rights. So, what is fair housing? Fair housing is the right to choose housing free from unlawful discrimination based on protected classes under federal, state, and local fair housing laws. Fair housing laws protect against discrimination in any housing transaction, which includes generally what people think of rentals and sales, lending, but also covers land use and zoning decisions. So, what are protected classes? At the federal level, we have race, color, religion, sex, disability status, which includes mental and physical disabilities, familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home, national origin. And then there is an equal access rule that is covered under HUD-funded housing, which I won't go too deep into, but those are also protected. And then at the state level, in addition to the protected classes, the federal protected classes, we have marital status, which is whether or not you're single, widowed, married, divorced, age, with the exception of certain types of senior housing. We have an expanded definition of race, which includes hairstyles that are historically connected to race, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and source of income. However, that is only covered in the rental housing arena. And then at the local level, it depends. There are many resources that you can, review. You can look at your municipality to see if they have protections. We also provided some links to some places where you can find some codes. They're usually under like Human Rights Ordinance, or they might be called the Fair Housing Ordinance. So it's always important to check those as they may have additional protections. So what is covered? Fair housing laws prohibit discrimination in dwellings. And a dwelling is defined as any building structure which is occupied, designed, or intended for occupancy. And this includes any vacant land. So that is kind of really why we're having this conversation today, as building housing is covered under fair housing laws. So I'm going to go over a few slides from our past sessions to kind of understand the type of fair housing things that we see. So the first one is community opposition. Across the country, including here in West Michigan, many communities are facing a serious lack of housing, especially housing that is affordable and accessible. One unfortunate but common challenge to work being done to address the lack of housing in our communities is community opposition. It's often called NIMBY. NIMBY, which stands for Not in My Backyard, is a term used to characterize when people living in or near a neighborhood oppose the addition of new housing or efforts to include more housing through changes in zoning or land use. Many people with NIMBY beliefs often understand that housing is needed, but they do not want these developments placed in their communities. There are many reasonable concerns neighbors might have about new or increased housing in their communities. However, NIMBYism can provide an avenue for housing discrimination, especially if it's based upon the people that are intended to live there. Strong and widespread opposition to housing can pressure local governments to act in discriminatory ways. Local officials might fear neighbors' responses if the project is approved. The Fair Housing Act prohibits local governments from making zoning or land use decisions or implementing land use policies that exclude or discriminate against people protected by fair housing law. When decisions about proposed housing developments are based on who is most likely intended or presumed to live there, the risk of fair housing violations increases, especially if the who in question is a group protected under fair housing laws. Local governments cannot consider neighbors' fears that someone of a particular race, national origin, religion, or disability status might live in a proposed development. Zoning ordinances cannot contain provisions that treat uses such as affordable housing, supportive housing, or group homes for people with disabilities differently than other similar uses. Municipalities cannot enforce ordinances more strictly against housing occupied by members of a protected class. So that was a very brief overview. And if you are interested in learning more about that, you can definitely visit our housing development page. We have recordings on there that kind of really dives deeper into the fair housing realm of this. But we will transition into the conversation with our panelists. We want you all to understand that housing being developed in our communities, fair housing laws apply and they must be upheld. As stakeholders in this work, you can help us identify potential violations and contact our office with questions or requests for best practices. If you believe housing discrimination is occurring, please contact your local fair housing center to report it. With that being said, I will now pass it over to Yarrow to begin this discussion between panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bree, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with these three other panelists who I've worked with throughout my time at Housing Norm. So I'm going to start with Ryan. And Ryan, can you briefly describe your background in housing development?
Sure. Yeah, so started in private sector as a consultant early in my career, kind of early 2000s, and then moved over to the public sector. Started to work for one of my clients, which was the city of Douglas. It's a small lakeshore community in West Michigan in Allegan County, and got a taste of a lot of things. In small towns, you get to wear a lot of hats and try on a lot of different opportunities. And in a seasonal small town, you really start to understand the impact of short-term rentals, seasonal homeowners on workforce housing. From there, I was tapped to go work for the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, where I did a lot of financing through the Brownfield Tax Increment Finance Program, as well as the Community Revitalization Program, really digging into the math and understanding why don't the kinds of development we need make financial sense in a lot of places, and what are the gap financing programs that are necessary to make them work. But as part of that work, I also began to understand that we were making it more difficult than it needed to be, meaning we made it more expensive, we created more regulatory barriers, we required more hoops to jump through than were necessary, which added to the cost, which added to the amount of gap financing that was necessary. So I took all of that information and helped to found Housing Next here in West Michigan, which covers Ottawa and Kent counties. And here we really focus on workforce housing, mostly households earning 50% up to 120% of the area median income, and talking to communities about what are the barriers that we are putting in the way. What are the other issues related to the labor force, related to financing, related to access to capital, all those kinds of things. And just recently, in the last 2.5 years, I've founded the consulting company Flywheel Community Development Services. And here we're applying a lot of the same principles we started with at Housing Next, but across a broader geography. So we serve the entire state of Michigan and a little bit outside of Michigan.
Thanks, Ryan. And so I'm going to go over to Eric next. Can you briefly describe your work in the housing development field?
Sure thing. So I run Michigan Community Capital. We are a developer, owner, and operator of mixed-use, mixed-income multifamily housing. We also develop for-sale housing. Like Ryan, we focus typically between 60 and 120% of the area median income. So all of our projects require some level of public support because we're holding expenses down to serve those income bands. And we really strive at MCC not to do just housing, but we look to do complete neighborhoods. So we do mixed uses with commercial and housing, and really work hard to try to come up with a complete neighborhood format where we can. So it's not always housing, but frequently housing. And we have about 300 units under management and about 600 in pre-development right now. And really just on the ground experience, whether it's financing the units or the construction due diligence to get them done, the local approvals to get them done, soup to nuts. And we try to take that learning and apply it in our lending and new market tax credit practice to other developers that are looking for financing to try to guide them through the development process as well.
Thanks, Eric. Can you remind me, when was MCC formed again?
So funny story on that. We were technically formed in 2005 to chase new market tax credits. We were successful 3 times before 2011, and then the organization kind of went dark and didn't really do anything until 2016. I came here in 2016 and was hired in 2017, and we won our first allocation in sort of the modern era in 2018. And we've got 6 consecutive allocations. We're actually technically the largest national allocatee over that 6-year period.
Awesome, thank you. So we're going to turn to Sarah. So Sarah, your day-to-day role is not in housing development, it's in philanthropy. Can you please share how and why you stepped into your role with the leadership team for the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership?
Yes, hello. You're right, Yarrow. My day-to-day is rooted in philanthropy. So the Petoskey Harbor Springs Area Community Foundation, our mission is to improve the quality of life for all people in Emmett County. And so because of that, the involvement with housing was really a natural extension of my work. But it really came about probably, gosh, I lose track of time, but 6, 7 years ago, there was a group that was just getting started. And every meeting that I went to in the community, housing kept coming up as a barrier that was preventing work from moving forward, whether that was in our nonprofit sector, our public sector, our small businesses. Housing was that through line that kept coming up. And so as an organization that's really rooted in our community, we felt like we needed to be at the table. We originally gave a grant to provide some technical training, some community conversation, and I got started participating in the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership at that time, and have been a member of the leadership team driving that strategy forward ever since then. We really, attainable housing for our region. It's a like Ryan talked about, it's a resort community. We have these lakeshore towns and inland towns that are all supported by tourism, recreation, and a seasonal economy by and large. So it's not just individuals, but entire sectors are really being held back by not having access to attainable housing, right? So from the community foundation's perspective, if we want to have vibrant, resilient communities in the area that we serve, which is Emmett County, we really can't ignore that foundation for safe, affordable housing. And so that really drives why I continue to be involved in the conversation today.
And just for those who don't know about the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, maybe just give a couple sentences about what that group is and when they formed and their role in the community.
Sure. So the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, I lose track again of time, but I think it was around 2016, 2017, was a group of community-minded individuals from various backgrounds and sectors who started coming together around this conversation around housing and how can we bring together solutions to impact our housing challenges in Emmett County. And so it's really a grassroots group of folks who got together and continue to meet regularly. We identified an action plan, and really early in our time, I think we were really modeled off of what was happening in Housing Next. We used to joke like we need a Ryan Kilpatrick up here, but we don't have a Ryan Kilpatrick. And so we really modeled what we were doing after what we saw happening in West Michigan, right? Like this idea of conversation, advocacy, building awareness of how housing, because the reality is housing is not a new conversation for our area. It's kind of that thing that always has been, but for the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, it's really become that underpinning of challenge. And so we basically kind of came to the point of like, we want to stop talking about it and do something about it. And I'll say early on, we had this really ambitious idea that we were going to bring 50 to 100 new units of housing. And here we are 7 years later, and those units are finally coming, but it was not within the 18 months that we originally thought. So that's been a journey for us all.
Thanks, Sarah. And that Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership was instrumental in our Housing Ready program through Housing North launching in that community in Charlevoix County. So just trying to make some connections
Yeah,
there.
we predate Housing North, so.
Exactly. And they were, just those, our work at Housing North is really integral on having these local housing action groups or advocacy groups in the community. So thank you, Sarah. And I think we'll pivot back to Ryan for a minute. Can you briefly describe Flywheel's approach to getting community input and engagement for housing development projects? And how does your approach work? What are some of the common issues, potentially fair housing issues that arise when you're working with communities?
Yeah,
That's a
so
long one, so you can take some time to answer it.
okay. Give me the hook if I'm taking too long. I'll try to be quick. What we really want to do first is understand the economic paradigm in the local community. And so we work with communities as diverse as Muskegon Heights, Lake County, Baldwin, where new construction doesn't appraise, and they need more housing, but they can't get it to pencil financially because they can't get it to appraise. All the way up to Grand Rapids, Grand Haven, Holland. We've worked with you, Yarrow, and with Sarah and Petoskey. Markets where you could easily sell stuff for $1 million or more, but what you need is housing priced at $200,000. And so figuring out how do we cover the gaps in land value and those kinds of things. So the first thing we always want to do with a community is level set and make sure we're all on the same page about what are the underlying economics that are driving the housing shortage or the inability for the workforce to access housing or the inability for the market to actually produce housing. And so usually what that includes is a demographic analysis so that we understand what are the household types in the community. Do we have a lot of singles and couples with no kids? Or do we have a lot of families with kids who are trying to move into the neighborhood? Predominantly across Michigan, what we're seeing more and more of is singles and couples with no kids as the largest segment of the housing market. And we continue to try to cater to families with kids as our primary mode of housing production. And we have a mismatch in terms of housing type there. So we talk through all that, but then we also talk through what are those fundamental market dynamics that are throwing things off. And then what we really want is for our decision makers and the people that they're listening to in the community to understand those core economic foundations so that we're not saying things like, oh, well, if people would just pay their workers more, we could solve for all of our housing shortages. It's actually the reverse, right? When we tend to have a shortage of housing, it doesn't matter how much you're paying workers, you're still going to have this competition for a scarcity of housing, and the folks with money are going to drive up the prices. So what we need to be doing is thinking about how do we get an abundance of housing available in the marketplace so that we don't have people in price wars bidding up the cost of housing by $20,000 or $30,000. But then the reverse, if we're working with a community that has lower incomes and lower appraisal values, again, we want to make sure that the decision makers in the community really understand what are those underlying market fundamentals that are problematic, and then talk through what are the key steps we can take at the local level, right? We're not going to rely on the federal government or even the state in some instances. What can we do at the local level to solve for as many of those barriers as possible? And oftentimes that includes pulling in partners like Eric Hanna with Michigan Community Capital or like our local community foundation to say, hey, we've got a financing barrier and we're going to need your help to solve it.
So Ryan, can you just elaborate a little bit on or share a little bit about the community profiles and that toolkit that you worked on with Housing North and how we use that in the communities?
Yeah. So part of our effort is really communicating who is it in the community that's in need of housing. And so from a fair housing perspective, we will often hear folks make kind of offhanded remarks where they say, well, gosh, do we really want low income folks in our communities, right? Do we want to invite those people? And often we'll hear those people in meetings. And part of our work is articulating the fact that there are many people who live in your community today who are spending 50% or more of their income on housing. They're here now. They're just significantly cost overburdened because there's not enough available housing. And those are the people that are driving your ambulances, that are teaching your kids, that are working at the grocery store, that are running your small businesses. that are protecting your communities from fire and crime, right? Like these are the essential workers that we really depend on, and we're failing to provide adequate housing for them. And so what we want to do is tell their stories, right? We don't want to just say, oh, this is for firefighters. We want to say, Carter, who's been a firefighter for the last 4 years, has been driving from Saginaw to Leelanau County, a 2.5 hour trip each way. He does 2 shifts on, and then he drives back home, stays with his parents in Saginaw, and then comes back 48 hours later for his next shift. Those are the things that we have to recognize are unsustainable over the long term. We cannot run a fire department on people who are going to drive 2.5 hours to do a shift. They have to be able to live in our communities. And being able to lay out those scenarios for teachers, for local restaurants, for the things that we all depend on and want in our communities, to say we have to have housing for the people that are managing all of the goods and services in our community.
Awesome. Thank you. So Eric, we're going to pivot back to you for a minute and ask you to share a success story of housing being developed in a community where there was strong community engagement and support for a housing project. Do you have an experience you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one Ryan's familiar with. So we actually built 30 homes in the city of Grand Haven. And 16 of those homes we sold for under $200,000. A lot of them we sold for $140,000 to $160,000 in partnership with a community land trust. So how did that happen? It's an $8 million project. $4 million of it was financed by a bank. That means we had to come up with $4 million in subsidy and soft equity. And Michigan Community Capital made no money on this. We made no return on investment. But we had a really engaged community foundation that came and offered us low-cost capital that we could use to bridge our tax increment financing, and that's exactly what we're doing with it. We had a city government who had a department that was going to assist the land trust, which was a private nonprofit, and so that department was going to staff the land trust and administer those contracts, those ground leases. We had utility support. We had support from the municipality that owned the land. We got the land for $1,000 a parcel, which in the city of Grand Haven is unbelievable. It really was like if you went around the clock and looked at all the different components that you needed to get that project to work, every single one of them was there, and we really didn't fight with anybody about it. There were some missteps. There's about a $700,000 miscalculation on the part of the cities that we had to paper over. Like in development, things happen, but everybody was at the table, and that included a lot of neighborhood associations that have been working with the city in preparation for additional housing to come in. And I know that it cost us $266,000 to build each house, all in. And that was with subsidized land, subsidized utility hookups, subsidized permitting fees. I mean, that was still the overall cost to construct those homes. And so when you're talking about selling more than half of them between $140,000 and $180,000, there's a big hole in that math. And so you have to have community support. And we were thrilled to do it. It was a great project. But an example of a project that didn't go that way, you can use the same project because there's a change in county administration, city administration, and all of a sudden they're very anti supporting housing. And they've been very vocal about that, including, shutting down that department and releasing people. And like the facts and circumstances on the ground changed radically in that community. And it just goes to show you that the ecosystem in which developers deploy risk capital, and particularly deploying that capital over multiple years to get projects done, is a very high risk environment. And so when you're talking about trying to promote housing in a community, what I think neighborhoods and stakeholders need to be aware of is that it is a very risk intensive business. And that risk can come anywhere from the interest rate market. It can come from the political apparatus. It can come from the public financing side. There's all kinds of ways that risk can take a project sideways. And one risk that the developer can see coming ahead of time and is likely not to want to battle is NIMBYism. You know, we as a developer, we have a scarce amount of capital and we cover the entire state of Michigan. So we can build anywhere we want to build. I'll give you another really great example. So we got recruited to go look at a property in the city of Dexter. Dexter's in Washtenaw County, super high rents, super expensive place to live, in desperate need of affordable housing. The whole area is in desperate need of affordable housing. It's arguably one of the most expensive places in the state to live. And so we said, great, we have this workforce product, we'll take a look at it. And then within a week, we found out that 3 other developers were solicited to look at that site. All of them were market rate for private, for-profit developers. And what we're getting back in terms of feedback from that site is that the city doesn't really care whether it's affordable. They're just happy to get the best price they can and the most money they can. And so they're not paying any attention to that. So you've got an opportunity there where you can have a really well-balanced, complete neighborhood type of product. And the city's been intentional about getting that space redeveloped to the tune of buying property and everything else. But there's no concern about who is going in there. And they're going to miss an opportunity to reinforce their community of only 5,000 people. I mean, that's all the people that live in that community. You know, they could reinforce that community in a big way if they were to pay a little bit more attention to affordability, but it feels like they might not. Just down the road, similar opportunity in Chelsea, similar community size, similar situation, same MSA in terms of, and that community is, their entire housing plan is focused on affordability. They know market rate developers are going to come in and do their thing. They're already doing it. They are having a horrible time attracting affordable and missing middle housing typologies. And they are, as a governmental unit, very focused on fixing that problem and finding ways to fix that problem. They've got some headwinds at the county who has some unreasonable demands around their housing TIF and some other things that have to get worked out. But the stark difference in 2 communities that are 15 miles away is just really telling. So, you know, neighborhood groups, community associations, condominium associations really have a lot of power and influence over where housing gets developed because political apparatus will listen. And it's all absolutely necessary. But I can just tell you at the outset, no developer, we're the most tolerant of brain damage developer there ever was. And we won't touch a community that has a political ideology that is divisive and where the community doesn't have a clear, plan on what they want to see in their community. We have to see that at the grassroots level before we start tackling all of those financial and operational and construction execution challenges. Those all come later.
Well, that's such a great segue, I think, to Sarah, because I think we've already dove into the NIMBYism topic here. But Sarah, before I ask you this question, maybe you could just give a little bit about the role the Community Foundation played in what I think is the first multifamily housing to be built in Petoskey in 20 years. And then I'll go to the follow-up question.
Sure. So first, I want to just touch on briefly what Eric was saying about, laying that groundwork and creating that environment for people to want housing in their community. And that is very much what the role of the last 5 or 6 years with the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership worked to do. We had kind of a 4-pronged, advocacy and education, outreach to policymakers and trying to impact policy through zoning reform and things like that. Building relationships with developers like MCC and others who would be interested in our community, and then bridging that financial gap for workforce housing projects, which we can talk about later. But the idea of building relationships is really how we got involved with the Lofts at Lumber Square, which is, like you said, 60 workforce housing apartments that are being constructed in the city of Petoskey within 2 blocks of our downtown area. There was a developer who was working on that project, and they had originally envisioned it as a low-income housing tax credit project and were not successful, which is actually very common for our northern Michigan region to not have those projects be successful. But because of that relationship that had been developed with that developer through the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership and the work that we had been doing to build awareness about housing, the community foundation was able to go to them and say, hey, what can we do to keep this project alive? Like, this is a fantastic project. To Eric's point, it checked all the boxes. It was on a redevelopment ready identified site by the city of Petoskey. The zoning was in place that allowed what was projected to be built there by right. So we didn't have to fight with zoning changes and things like that. They had actually already received their initial approvals for the site plan and things like that. So and the community had said, like, yes, this is what we want here. So we weren't fighting all of those things. We, as a community foundation, just said, like, we can't let this project fall apart at this stage because, as we've discussed, the location was such that somebody else would have developed it and it would have been luxury condos or, one or two expensive houses, because that's what the market really supports in our area. So we got involved. We did something that we have never done before, and we purchased the land to preserve it for future workforce housing development, and then decided to figure out what we were going to do then. So really kind of, I joke that happened by accident, but and in some ways it did. But it also happened because of those relationships that we were building through the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, and that identified work that we had done to say, like, this is what our community needs. I think the other thing that we had to play on there was some housing needs assessment work that had been done that showed that we really needed that workforce housing and rental units in particular. And so it checked those boxes of what the community needed. And so we could come to the table and say, okay, how can we keep this project alive? And I don't think we intended to be where we ended up with the project, which is, filling that financial gap to the tune of $4 million. But that's what the project needed to pencil out. And so that's where the community foundation came to the table.
That's awesome. I think you kind of answered the question, which was just around the tools and messaging, to be successful. Feel free to elaborate if you want, but I think I want to ask you a little bit more about, what you see within your community when it comes to discrimination, housing discrimination, and NIMBYism, and how has the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership worked to address this?
Sure.
If you feel like you have.
Yeah, I do feel like we have. And unfortunately, like many communities, we do encounter NIMBYism and whether it's, fear of rental housing or stigma around affordability or pushback that's kind of cloaked in concerns about like neighborhood character. Those are all like common messaging that we hear when housing projects are proposed in a community. And so the housing partnership, the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, very early on leaned into education and relationship building. Like I said, we went around very early in our existence and made presentations to pretty much anybody who would listen to us, local units of government, community groups, civic organizations, neighborhood groups. We have a lot of resort communities. We would try and present at neighborhood groups to really just help them understand like who it is that we need housing for in our community. And like Ryan said earlier, that messaging of, talking about the people who need housing in our community, whether it's your child's teacher or the person who manages the retail store downtown, or we have a regional hospital that serves our area. We have a lot of healthcare workers who can't afford to live in our community. So really putting a face to the issue of who doesn't have housing. And so that was really core to our messaging. And make people understand that this is about our people in our community. One of the things we say about the Lost Lumber Square is we want to make sure that the people who work here can be able to live here. And that is becoming increasingly difficult in Northern Michigan. The example of driving, one of the largest imports to our area is our workforce. So that's problematic in a lot of ways, but just the response time for emergency workers and things like that. So we really leaned into that storytelling aspect of that, and then I think supported by the data, because I think helping people understand what the issue is of affordability, because it's really difficult to help people understand why these numbers don't pencil out. I think Ryan earlier was saying, there's this perception that developers are just lining their pockets. And so we really tried to dispel that myth early on too, because we wanted people to understand that this is the this isn't people just trying to take advantage of the system here. This is really just impossible to build workforce housing that is affordable to the people who live here year round. So again, a lot of community conversations, talking to pretty much anybody who would listen to us, presenting that data alongside the storytelling, and really leaning into the idea that these are the folks who already work in our community, and they're your neighbors and the people who, you know, teach your children and the people who coach Little League and all those things. If they can't live where they work, the idea of volunteering or doing the things after hours of work really starts to fall apart, because you're not going to have a teacher volunteer for your kids' athletic team if they've got to drive an hour and a half home after school gets out. So really leaning into that aspect of it.
Well, and I think there's a lot to be celebrated, especially in Northwest Michigan, but you know, throughout the state. I think Petoskey created a neighborhood enterprise zone. You know, there are some really awesome, I guess, implementation of the new housing tools as well that is helping to attract these developments and even smaller scale developments to the region. So Ryan, I'm going to pivot back to you to talk a little bit about when you're working with communities, what have you found the best way to talk about or help communities understand illegal housing discrimination, especially in the form of NIMBYism? And what have you found as the best way to engage during the process to talk about this?
Yeah, so I think the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan does a great job of clearly articulating the protected classes at both the federal and the state level. And so we typically will repeat their talking points, because I think we can't do it any better than the Fair Housing Center. But the other thing that we often will do is simply name the fact that when we express concerns about who is going to live in a place, we are being discriminatory and exclusionary. And even though income, so income broadly, not source of income, but just general income, is not a protected class, when we say, oh gosh, we don't know if we want people to live here who can't afford to buy their home, we're being exclusionary and we're discriminating. And what we want to do is make it a little bit uncomfortable for local communities to feel okay about doing that. And very often, especially in suburban and rural communities, we'll have a couple of planning commissioners who will say, well, if they can't afford to buy a house here, maybe they just need to keep working harder, and someday this community could be an opportunity for them. And we have to push back on those things, even when we are their consultant and our income depends on them paying us. We have to be able to push back on those kinds of comments, to acknowledge the fact that every single one of the folks who sit on those planning commissions had a first housing option. Whether it was when they graduated from high school or left college, they probably didn't buy a single family house in a brand new subdivision as their first housing choice. Most people rent something for a couple of years while they figure out their life. And sometimes they're renting a single family house. Sometimes it's a townhouse. Sometimes it's an apartment above the garage, right? Sometimes it's in a multifamily complex. But if you ask people, almost always they have a story about some sketchy place that they lived when they were in their early or mid 20s, that they're like, gosh, I don't know if I would do that again. But if I didn't have that option, I don't know what I would have done, right? I might not be here today. And so even while we're trying to check people in the way that they talk about excluding those who can't afford to buy or can't afford the cost of land or whatever it is in their community, we also really want to humanize this and get people to express their own empathy via their experience, right? We want them to remember what it was like. And sometimes too, we'll do some storytelling around family separations, right? When a couple of parents choose to separate, but they still both want to be close to their kids. It's really a pain when dad's got to move, 12 miles away and get in the car and drive through traffic in order to pick up kids and take them to soccer practice. When dad can rent something that's, just a few blocks away from where they've lived as a family for a long time, that actually does a lot for social cohesion. It does a lot for the kids' mental health and well-being in some situations. And so we really want to humanize these stories as we push back on that potential for discrimination.
Thanks, Ryan. Eric, I know you talked a little bit about NIMBYism and maybe an example of a project that didn't go well and went well, but do you want to give another experience where community opposition, especially NIMBYism, an experience you had with that in a community?
I mean, the two things that kill deals are parking and politics, right? Um, we have both of those. I saw some questions in the comment about, how do you balance the trade-off between property values and investment and, uh, the needs to bring affordable and workforce housing to a community to meet employers' needs and allow the community to grow. Those are competing priorities, but they don't have to be competing priorities. A lot of the issues um, that are being addressed in that question really come down to both design and execution. So, uh, you know, if the development is thoughtfully designed, if the parking is carefully studied and addressed within the development, and if the operator of a low to moderate income housing development is a good operator, then you're going to have a project where you're not trading property values for affordability. It's a false choice to say that you have to do those things. It's an absolute false choice. What it really gets down to is what is the quality of the team that is going to develop and operate that organization. Communities have a lot of pull in terms of signing community benefits agreements and restricting the way a development can be run if they choose to exercise those. And one way that a community who's very nervous about having affordable housing come into their community, one thing they can do is they can go interview the operator, go look at their other properties, see if they're cleaned up, see if they're properly managed. Talk to the city manager in those communities and find out if the fire and EMS and police responses are similar, higher, or lower, and why. Part of it is just doing real due diligence. And sometimes it's hard to get part-time city commissioners and planners and managers to do that. But ownership matters, execution matters, design matters. All of those things help take away this false choice we have between uh, you have to have either affordable housing or strong property values. I actually think communities' property values go up when you can add density. You just have to do it in a way that doesn't have those adverse consequences. And I mean, there is, I think, a stretching point sometimes where you get to the point where you are starting to trade off those things. But man, in the state of Michigan is completely different than the state of California, and we are not in a situation right now where we have to trade affordability for quality of life or property values or investment values. We just don't. I think it's an entirely false narrative. So I don't think that answered your question, but I just wanted to put that out there because I think that's a big thing people have in their mind is that they're trading one for the other. In Cadillac, where we've invested over $30 million to date, one of their resistances to having a tax credit project was that they have 9 tax credit projects. It's the only kind of housing that ever got built there. And their EMS, fire, and city responses to those communities are higher than they are to the rest of the city. And so they're considered a drag on city resources. A lot of that has to do with, did they investigate the operator? Did they go see the other sites? Did they impose conditions on the operation? Did they impose conditions on change in control of the operation? Did they work with the Housing Development Authority on the design? One of the issues you run into is if there's strict design criteria at the Housing Authority level, that doesn't let you adjust the development to fit in the fabric of the neighborhood. That's an issue, right? So I just think a lot of what goes on is not enough due diligence in the design and execution. And if you have a community that's very sensitive about this, particularly in a sensitive location, a lot of problems can be solved and addressed by just taking a time and doing that work.
Ryan or Sarah, do you want to add to that at all? No?
I'm just going to echo what Eric said. There's a ton of data now. We've got more than 2 decades worth of research from really well-known institutions in the research realm. Universities, the Mercatus Center, the Turner Center, the Harvard Joint Center, Brookings Institution, all have done the research and all have found that affordable housing does not reduce property values. What does reduce property values is when you exclude and isolate one population from the rest of the community and you isolate them from jobs and services, right? And we did a good job of that in the 60s and 70s. I think right now the process of developing affordable housing is much more integrated into the broader community. And this is part of the reason we're talking about zoning reform in so many circles, is allowing a greater diversity of housing options in every neighborhood. Again, begins to eliminate the stigma, begins to eliminate the isolation. It's those factors that tend to reduce property values. So if anybody wants the research, we can create a short list of studies to go check out. But I completely agree with Eric.
And I'll just add, I think a lot of times the NIMBYism and the opposition to things really stems from a place of fear and unknown. So in our communities, there's been a couple of instances where projects have faced opposition from neighbors and community members. And what really they needed was an avenue to have their voice and their fears heard and listened to, and to feel like they were being taken seriously. Obviously, that you have to balance that with keeping the project, moving forward, and the time that can take, but giving people that forum for letting their fears be heard, and then having that really pointed conversation about what's based in reality, and what are things that are actually going to happen. A lot of in our community, the pressure to grow, right? This growth pressure is a thing that people are fearful of. They do not want to become our neighbors to the south that are more populated and things like that. People live here because they like that rural feel. And so there's this fear that we're going to grow and become overrun. But the reality is we are not, if you look at the data, we are not growing in the total numbers, but what we are doing is changing a demographic of our community in a way that makes it so, it makes it very difficult for the vitality of our community to continue if we don't have a workforce in the future. So I think we have to dispel the misinformation and the fears, but give people that opportunity for their voices to voice their concerns.
Thank you. And Brianna is going to put some resources out there too, but for best practices, I would say around zoning reform and, becoming housing ready, there are some resources that we can share, but, really there's a zoning reform toolkit that MAP has, and like, based on what everybody said today, those resources can help communities create the type of housing that they need. So we'll make sure we share those as well. So what I'm going to put this out to all and one of you guys can decide to pop in and answer first, but what is one thing you want community members to know or do when they hear about housing being developed in their community? So any one of you can start if you have a good answer to that, or I'll call on you if you don't pop in. Just one thing you want community members to know.
Because I know Ryan and Eric probably have an answer to this, but to speak up and show your support for it at public meetings, at the public forums. A lot of times our local elected officials only hear from the people opposed to things. So if you support something, show up and put your voice to that, because they need to hear from the people who support things as well as the people who are opposed.
Yeah, totally agree with Sarah. The other thing is, if you're a community member and you're not really sure what's happening, be very wary of Facebook posts and social media. A lot of times things get blown out of proportion. They get characterized in a way that isn't accurate. So go down to City Hall and meet with the local planning official or the city manager or the township supervisor and ask questions. Be curious before you decide you're going to join the no campaign. And be informed even before you go support it. If you want to just go get more information, make sure you understand what's happening. I think very often especially on social media, we'll find that people are opposed to it outright, and then they will invent reasons to try to convince people to agree with them.
Eric, do you have anything to add? One thing you want community members to know when they hear about housing being developed in their community?
I think developers' attitudes, the developers are in a competitive environment usually. And so it's their predisposition not to sort of let the cat out of the bag and to operate, as below the radar as they can, to avoid what I like Ryan characterized as sort of like the Facebook army, coming out in full force. The No developer should ask for public incentives or try to do a deal that would be characterized as a public-private partnership in the dark. You should be transparent with the community that you're working in. There's nothing to hide. There's no reason. This is all for the community's good. So there's no reason to be cagey about it. And I think developers have a predisposition to sort of be close-lipped about it, where if you take the opposite approach and you go wide and you allow people to ask questions and meet their needs in terms of due diligence, a lot of the things that are scary about a development will not be scary anymore. This lack of knowing from a community member's perspective what's going to happen can and should be addressed by a combination of information from the city and from the developer. And if you have a developer who is asking for incentives to make something like this happen and is not being transparent with you, as we do here in the city of Lansing, then I agree that community members should be cautious about that. I really do. And but doing the due diligence and getting engaged and not relying on social media to give you information is really, really important, because there are significant downsides, as Ryan has suggested, to not meeting the needs of affordable housing in the area. And so the way for it not to be scary is to get to know it better and to do the due diligence, right? And then you're not scared anymore. And in that process, hard questions can get asked and changes can get made and answers can happen. But it's much easier, and we find this not just with housing, but like with many topics in life, it's much easier just to be told what to think and be okay with that. And I think that a lot of community members fall into that trap, and then their electeds are, trying to decide who to listen to, who has, and what they need to do is listen to who has better information. That's who should prevail in that conflict.
So as someone who maybe can't make it to a public meeting or get there and show up, do you think letters to your county commissioners or your electeds are still helpful to be able to share that you support a housing project? If
And
you
email.
can't go in person, email.
You got email. As long as you're communicating with the proper person, most of the time they're happy to give you answers. And if you have to do it in the evening with email, do it in the evening with email. But you just have to make sure that the information you're getting is coming from a credible source, because 8 out of 10 times it's not.
Thank you all. I think we answered most of the questions in the chat, but I just wanted to read this one to make sure, Brian, maybe you didn't want to elaborate on it. What is the compromise between those that are concerned about property value with building affordable housing to get people that support the community in the community? I think we answered that, but I just want to make sure we hit it.
Yeah, honestly, there isn't a compromise, and I think it's a matter of presenting the data and being really clear. There's plenty of research that suggests that actually new affordable housing in high-income census tracts increases property values. New affordable housing in lower-income census tracts increases or has a net zero impact on property values. I was just going to post a link in the Q&A chat so everybody's got access to those studies. It doesn't have to be a compromise, and when people bring it up, calmly and politely, let them know that there is no compromise, that actually it can be very much a win-win.
Thank you. So this is for everybody again, but you can decide who wants to answer first if you feel compelled. For communities or groups just embarking on this work around housing in their community and getting active, engaged, where should they start, or what should they start thinking about to start moving this work forward? So I'm thinking, for example, like a very rural community who maybe not be quite ready for housing. Any thoughts there? It's a big one.
I mean, I'll jump in. We always want to make sure that people understand their local market dynamics first, right? What's the problem that we actually need to solve at the local level? It's great to look at national best practices and statewide best practices, but your market is always going to have some of its own unique characteristics, and make sure that the barriers you're trying to remove or the solutions that you're proposing are actually representative of the conditions on the ground in your community. But then two, build a little band of supporters, right? I mean, Yarrow, I think your team has demonstrated a really extraordinary skill in doing this, is find the other people in the community that care about it, who are willing to talk about it, and get on the same page together, right? Figure out how you want to talk about these things collectively. Figure out the terminology you're going to use, right? Some communities are using workforce housing, some are talking about attainable housing. Just get on the same page so that you're not creating confusion in the community about what you mean by what. And then really work at communicating. And that can be sort of big, broad messaging out to the community, but it can also be coffee meetings, it can be dinner parties, it can be the chit chat that happens in the first 5 minutes of an unrelated meeting where you're just like, oh, yeah, I'm on this affordable housing task force and we're trying to solve this problem. The more that other people in the community feel like there is momentum around a thing, the more likely it is that they're going to support it. And so if you can be a part of building that momentum just by getting on the same page with some of your collaborators, using some of the same messaging, talking about solutions in the same way, that's a great way to start to build momentum. And then the last thing is find your key champion. This has to be something that somebody in the community is working on every day. It doesn't necessarily have to be a full-time job, but somebody's got to be thinking about it a lot and continuing to push that ball forward, because this is hard. There's going to be a lot of resistance. And if there's not a local champion that's willing to push a little bit every day, you start to backslide.
Sarah or Eric, did you want to elaborate on that one at all?
I completely agree with what Ryan said. The playbook that he outlined is very much the playbook of the Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership. Those community conversations, we put together a presentation that was consistent, that we could all be using, so that the data was the same, the barriers that we identified were the same. We just shared that and had that, like I said before, literally to anybody who would hear us. And I spoke to a lot of diverse groups, and we had a little group of 5 or 6 of us who were prepared to present that and have that conversation, so that it didn't have to fall on any one person. But yeah, very much just making sure that we understood what the issue was and that we were helping other people understand what the issue was.
I think that most NIMBYism happens in, medium to high wealth communities. By and large, when low income housing is developed in low income communities, it's the nicest housing that's there. And so it's usually pretty welcomed. So I would say for those people working in medium to high income communities where you're experiencing this, understand that the business community in your area is a natural ally, because they are going to see wage pressure and hiring time pressure if these concerns don't get addressed. And so when you're in the community looking for natural allies, understand that it's as much of a workforce development issue and a business sustainability issue as it is a housing issue. Housing is really a tool. It's one cog in the economic wheel, and employers who are in the community now, generating tax revenue now, contributing to the community foundation now, they are directly impacted by this issue. And so one place that as a concerned person you can go is to your employer community, and you can probably find some natural allies there. And I just think that that is an often underlooked place to go. And those individuals tend to be consolidators of money and speech. And so I just think don't leave that stone unturned.
Thank you. I'm just trying to catch up on the questions here. I think we got most of them. I guess, one thing, just I like this question, but it might be a little too big. But Ryan, what is your biggest hope for the future, I guess, in housing in Michigan? I'll put a caveat on that, not in general. But what would be your biggest hope right now for the future of housing in Michigan?
Michigan is still relatively affordable as a state. compared to most of the country. We got some pockets like Petoskey that are not as easy to get affordability. But we have big opportunities for the starter home market. I think we could lead the country in access to affordable home ownership. But what we really need to be doing is focusing on right sizing our minimum lot requirements or eliminating them altogether. Thinking about parking, thinking about setbacks, all those kinds of things that impact the cost of building, and deciding collectively as local communities, are those things more important than people having access to affordable home ownership, right? So what I'm most hopeful about is I think that we are building a groundswell. I think that there are a lot of people, Garo, in your region, down here in West Michigan. I'm talking to folks at Cornerstone and Benton Harbor, and we're hearing more and more from the east side of the state. A lot of common threads. And I think if we can get on the same page, create some templates that make it really easy for local units of government to change some of their local standards and make it easier to build affordable home ownership, as well as those interim steps, right? A starter home doesn't have to be owner occupied. Also creating those missing middle, small scale infill rental opportunities so that people can step on that first rung of the economic ladder of opportunity before they're ready for home ownership. And that can be integrated into safe, stable, attractive, walkable neighborhoods.
Oh, I'm so glad this was recorded. Very well said. Thanks, Ryan. Eric, do you want to elaborate on that? What's your biggest hope for the future for housing in Michigan?
I mean, I hope we pass the community redevelopment tax credit. I really, I'm a rubber meets the road kind of guy because we're in the trenches every day, actually building the units, and we have an opportunity to make Michigan a very competitive state. You know, our organization is aligned with the MEDC, and I talk a lot about jobs because housing is really just a tool to make us economically competitive with Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And they regularly eat our lunch. So we have a chance to like fix this if we just focus on it in the right way. And I mean, there are a lot of stakeholders in Michigan talking about this right now. And we have some excellent leadership in place. We just need to finish. And if we can get some good long-term tools in place and leave them alone, I think we've got a really good chance to control the pace of housing and create more natural affordability as we move forward. So I think, you know, there's a couple very specific actions that we can take and to gain that momentum. And I think the inverse is true too. If we fail at that level, we're going to find ourselves set back. We're the only state that doesn't have companion credits for light tech, new markets, and historic tax credits. Our historic tax credit's a joke right now. So, I mean, when you're surrounded by 6 other states that have all those tools and really know how to use them very well, it puts you at an economically competitive disadvantage. And so I like our chances of getting back in the game, but we definitely have to finish. And it's not just about the houses, it's about everything that housing facilitates in our communities.
Sarah, what do you think? What's your biggest hope for housing in the future? Or biggest hope for the future of housing in Michigan?
Yeah, it's kind of piggybacking on what Eric said. I mean, obviously, I'm really steeped in a very specific geographic region in Northwest Lower Michigan. But my hope for the future is like that we recognize the moment that we're in, that we have the opportunity to right the ship on our housing affordability and choice and options for people in our state. And that, 10 years from now, we're not facing the situation that some of our other states. I've lived elsewhere in the country out west and elsewhere in the Midwest. And I think we do have an opportunity, despite, me being in a very expensive place where it feels like affordability is out of reach. I think we still have the opportunity to bring housing solutions to the table and to offer people choice. And my hope is that we seize that moment, and that the work that we're doing now, in 10 years from now and 15 years from now, we can look back on that and say, okay, we made a difference then.
Awesome. Well, I think each one of you is making a pretty huge difference already. I think, I can ask a few more questions. I just wanted to check in with Bree and the Fair Housing Center folks while While they're coming back on to let us know how many more minutes we have, I do want to give a plug for the Fair Housing Center and encourage people that if you are working in housing and you have a question, just call them. They have been a huge resource for me. Whenever I have something that comes up in our work, we just send them the information and, they help us answer that question. Plus, they have a lot of resources on their website. So, Bree, did I miss any questions? I think I got through quite a few and answered the chat, but just let me know.
Yeah, this has been really great. Something that we wanted to just kind of um, address. So there's been a lot of emphasis on workforce housing. And from our perspective, this often leaves people out based on age or if they have a disability. So overall, who do you who might be left out that also, when thinking about developing housing, are we considering all of the protected classes when developing housing? And, if you guys are addressing that in your conversations, how does that look, when addressing that with community members? We kind of had that kind of question, but we've talked a lot about workforce housing, and that is a big thing that's happening across, all in the housing development field. So, yeah.
Anybody want to tackle that one, Ryan?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're working through this challenge in Grand Rapids right now, recognizing we need a lot more permanent supportive housing units, especially for adults with disabilities who aren't able to work. And so really thinking through what are the housing typologies that are necessary and that we can afford to get built, and provide the appropriate wraparound services and case management. And the root of that is, first of all, are we allowed to build it? Second, can we build it in a place that makes economic sense, right, for the particular type of housing? And so there's a lot of work to do there. We're going to run into more NIMBY concerns related to permanent supportive housing than just about any other housing type. And yeah, oftentimes what happens is that population is often doubled up or in shared housing, or kind of co-housing arrangements that are informal and actually create a lot less stability when we don't have dedicated permanent supportive housing with wraparound services. So part of this is going to be dialogue with the community about what does it mean to have permanent supportive housing? What does it mean to have single room occupancy style housing? How does it benefit the community as opposed to pretending that we don't have an issue with homelessness, and then dealing with it either on the street or with folks sleeping in cars? There's a lot of different facets here, and part of the challenge is getting people to want to talk about it. Because it's a tough issue. It's really sad to know that we've allowed homelessness to get as bad as we have. And so getting people to come to the table and have a conversation and recognize that housing needs to be a right. And we've got to try to build or create the most appropriate housing type for the individual's needs.
I mean, this is a very tough situation. And the ugly truth of it is we need a comprehensive federal solution for this that is not just housing. We need a safety net system in place that includes housing for this system. Because when local units of government attempt to address this, number one, it's the single most expensive housing per unit you can build because of the permanent supportive system. So if you build a lot of it, you're sacrificing all of the other kinds of affordable housing that you could be building because you're building the most expensive unit you could possibly build. And then the second thing is, if you do a great job with it, word travels, and all of a sudden your resources will end up being overwhelmed, and you'll have to do it again. There's that is the conundrum with permanent supportive housing, and it is vexing in the absence of a cohesive and well-rounded federal solution. And if you look anywhere else in the world that's doing this well, that's exactly what they have. They have a solution that involves housing, education, workforce training, and medical care, and it's all being provided in the same group by the same organization, and it's coordinated care. We don't even have coordinated care for people who have regular health insurance right now. All of their care is farmed out to specialists who don't even pick up the phone and talk to each other. So permanent supportive housing is it's the single toughest thing to do. And Um, it is very sad because in this country, we absolutely have the resources to fix it. In fact, the resources to fix this are so modest compared to the federal budget that it's almost laughable. Um, I think to get every person in the country who needs one housing choice voucher is around $20 billion a year right now. I mean, that's pocket change for federal programs. It's silly. The whole thing's just silly. So I don't know what to do with permanent supportive housing. It's super tough. And I give a lot of credit to communities who try to tackle it, but even the ones that do a really great job with it, that the 5-10 year outcome of it is bleak. I mean, there were stories in the paper, just 2 weeks ago about folks who traveled to Kalamazoo because they thought Kalamazoo had a great infrastructure in place, and they were there for 2 weeks and left. Where did they go? They went to the next place they thought had good infrastructure for it. And that is just repeating itself over and over again. It's the hardest problem in housing to solve by a country mile.
And I think just thinking about language too, where we are, we have a lot of seasonal folks. We also have a lot of folks who are coming up here to retire. So they're not necessarily in the workforce. So we're trying to think about that word we can use. That I always say housing for all. But we do have to think about that, especially when people are asking for deed restrictions for year-round housing. I think really what we're trying to say is we want people to live here year-round. Regardless of who they are, we want that year-round housing, and we need it all. So that's kind of where Housing North is coming from, and trying to be careful about not just saying it's for one group or type of people, because it really is a huge spectrum of need. Those that have a fixed income, those that have retired here. And where we are, I think we've mentioned this, but in Northwest Michigan, our vacancy rate is 0.7%. So that's really, there really is not a whole lot of choice. And I think really what it is for us is thinking about the choices and the opportunity for people to be able to choose that housing and having enough of it available across that whole spectrum of where your income is coming from.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Yarrow. Yeah, that is a big, as we talked about, it's just a big thing that's going on in the housing development field. And as the Fair Housing Center is something that we want to address. And so we are working on resources to kind of talk about workforce housing or targeted housing by populations. So be on the lookout for any materials coming from us on that vein. I just have one final question, and then we will wrap up for the day. And this is hopefully an easy one. Is there anything that anyone didn't get to share that they were hoping to share today, kind of in, talking about housing development, when we're trying to get communities to get involved in this and, the process, for community members. That's really what the goal of this, overall series was. So if there's anything you guys want to share, insights that you didn't get to, now is really the chance. So feel free to chime in if you have anything.
I'll chime in since I'm already unmuted and share something because I'm the only panelist who doesn't come from a development background or the housing background. And so my advice to community members is to not be overwhelmed or daunted by a subject that can be very complex and hard to understand, right? Like you can still play a role, you can still lend your voice. I definitely have learned a lot over the last 5 to 7 years. And so it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You don't have to be an expert at the outset to care about housing and to get involved in solutions in your community.
I don't think it was mentioned, but I just think the zoning atlas work that's happening is really cool. And it is going to be a tool for communities like Northwest Michigan, others to really understand how zoning can be a barrier to building the housing. So I think just getting communities excited about that and just trying to really understand, some of those barriers, that can be a tool that can be helpful.
I just want to say, don't get in the habit of letting people generalize who we're talking about. I think you need to meet people and shake their hands and let them know who we're talking about, whether it's an elderly person, a veteran. I have 5 school teachers in the city of Ludington who live in my building. I mean, that's a high concentration for a single project, but the school is 3 minutes away. And we can talk to those people. They're not just some general low income person, right? those are those 5 people. We know their names, right? So I think people get in the habit of generalizing their concerns, and a recourse to doing that is just to be specific. You know, what it's much harder to you know uh, criticize somebody when it's that person to their face. And so when we run into general broad criticism about groups, getting beyond that narrative and bringing people in to talk about their situations, who are willing to share whatever that situation is and whatever band of income they are, whatever class they're in, is more salient than allowing just broad generalizations to run the narrative. So I think that is a missed opportunity that housing advocates need to pay close attention to. And also, it's a very natural thing because you're just meeting your neighbors and friends and people you want to be your neighbors. So there's nothing scary about that. I think people who get intimidated by a certain group of people don't know them. So the answer to that question is not to further isolate them. The answer to that question is to get those people together under whatever context you need to. Whatever pretext you need to create, find one and get them together and get them talking, because they're going to find out that they're not as scary as they think.
Ryan, did you have any last words?
I think the one thing we didn't talk about, Eric just lightly touched on it, is we're about to have 75 million baby boomers over the age of 65, single adult, 2 adult households primarily, who aren't going to want to age in place in the big old houses that they have, but are really feeling stuck right now. I often mentally generalize baby boomers as being much wealthier than my generation and having a whole lot more assets, but that's not true of the entire generation. We're going to have millions of seniors who are going to need affordable, smaller, more community-oriented housing options, and they kind of need them now. So really thinking about how do we design neighborhoods that are full for the full life cycle, and not just saying, nope, we only build single family homes here, and if it doesn't work for you, sorry, get out of here. We've got a major generational shift happening right now, and we need to be able to accommodate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here today and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. And then I am going to share my screen really quick because as everyone shares, we have an evaluation. So folks, please, attendees, please share your feedback and take this evaluation. It should be open in your browser. You can also scan the QR code. But as Yarrow mentioned, you can contact our office if you have questions about this process. If you're hearing things at public meetings, or you have an idea on that housing that you wanted to put in place, contact our office. We can talk you through it. We can do some technical assistance on that. Yeah, so that is my last spiel. And again, thank you to all our speakers for being here today. We really, really appreciate it. And with that, after you take the evaluation, you're free to jump off. We really, again, appreciate your spending your time with us this afternoon. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thanks.